I have known Lucien Marchmont since we were boys of 8, and in all that time I heard him say a great many correct things and almost nothing true, so I am perhaps the only man alive who can tell you exactly when he broke. Not the day the physician feared for his life, but a full quarter-year earlier, on a warm morning in June, when a woman in a gray dress set a tray of letters at his elbow and he did not look up, and she left the room, and he let her. You would not have marked it. I nearly did not. But I was standing at the window of the breakfast room at Marchmont Hall, and I saw Miss Hartwell pause 1/2 second in the doorway with her hand on the frame, the way a person pauses who has just decided something, and then go on. And I knew Lucien well enough to know he had felt her pause the way you feel a draft, and had chosen, out of 9 years of stubborn habit, to say nothing. I should tell you who they were, because the whole matter turns on it. Lucien was the Duke of Marchmont, and the county called him the Silent Duke, and the county, for once, was not being unkind, only accurate. He was tall and dark and terribly still, with a face that gave away nothing and eyes that saw everything, and he had been that way since the winter we were 19, when the fever took his mother and his younger brother within a fortnight of each other, and left him the last Marchmont standing in a house built for a family. I was there. I watched a warm, quick-tempered, laughing boy walk into that sick-room, and a marble man walk out, and I have spent the 20 years since half-hopping the boy was only sleeping somewhere under the marble. He did not grieve as other men grieve. He did not weep or rage or drink. He simply closed the way a great door closes without violence and stayed closed. He learned to run the estate to the last farthing, to sit in the House of Lords and speak in 3 sentences what other men spent an hour saying, to be admired and feared and consulted and never, not once, known. Women flung themselves at the title and recoiled from the man. He was thought proud. He was not proud. He was afraid, I think, that if he ever again let himself want a thing that could die, he would not survive the second loss. So he wanted nothing allowed. He allowed himself no warmth he would have to mourn. And into that shut house, 9 years before that June morning, came Miss Clara Hartwell. She was a gentlewoman, that word meant something then, the daughter of a Shropshire clergyman of good blood and no fortune, orphaned at 20 and left with a small brother to school and no means to do it. She might have married dull and been safe. Instead, she took a housekeeper's place at a great house, which for a woman of her birth was a long, quiet step down that she took without a single word of complaint, because it paid enough to keep her brother in books. She came to Marchmont on a 3-month trial. She stayed 9 years. I will not tell you she was a beauty. She was not. In the way the season measured beauty, she had no dazzle, no bloom got up for a ballroom. She had something steadier. She was of middle height and plain in her dress, always that same soft gray or brown, and she wore her fair hair in a simple knot with a few strands forever escaping it, and her face was the kind you do not notice at first and then cannot stop noticing, because everything in it was true. When she was pleased her whole face warmed. When she was grieved you knew it though she said nothing, and her eyes, gray as a wet slate roof, looked at you as though you were worth the looking. She was not soft. She was kind, which is a harder and rarer thing, and she was clever in the way that keeps 100 plates spinning and never lets you see the effort. For that was what she did. She kept Marchmont. You must understand the size of the thing. A house like Marchmont is not a home. It is a small kingdom. 40 indoor servants, and I could not tell you how many out. Tenants and rents and repairs, a dairy and a laundry and a still room, the vast cold staterooms and the warm hidden ones, the London house to be opened for the season and shut again, the mourning cards and the Christmas boxes and the sick cottagers and the endless small decisions that a place that size throws up by the hour. All of it for 9 years, ran because Clara Hartwell decided that it should, quietly, before anyone knew there was a decision to be made. Let me give you a day of her, so you understand what walked out of that house, and what a man may fail to see when it is set before him every hour. I remember a morning in my first autumn as a fixture at Marchmont. I had the blue room by then, when a boy came pounding up the avenue at dawn from the Barlow farm at the far edge of the estate, half the roof of the old byre gone in a night gale, and the beasts loose and Barlow's wife near her time and frightened out of her wits. Now, a great house has a machinery for such things, but the machinery must be set going, and the setting going of it is 100 small judgments. I came down to find the whole of it already in motion, and Miss Hartwell in the middle of it like the still point of a wheel. The steward already dispatched with 2 men and a cart of timber, the second groom already gone for the midwife over at Netherby, a basket already packed with broth and clean linen, and a bottle of the good brandy from the cellar that only she had the key to. And she was standing in the cold flagged passage in her gray dress writing 3 things at once in her little book, and speaking gently to the terrified boy, who had stopped shaking. And when I said, half laughing, that she had emptied the house before it was properly awake, she looked up at me with those gray eyes and said, quite simply, "It is only that I thought what I should want, Mr. Sefton, if it were my roof and my husband's beasts and my own hour coming on. It is not difficult. One only has to think what the other person is feeling and then do the obvious thing." And she went back to her book. I have turned that sentence over for 20 years. One only has to think what the other person is feeling and then do the obvious thing. It was the whole of her, and it was, precisely, the one thing Lucian had made himself unable to do, for to feel what another is feeling, you must let yourself feel, and he had shut that door at 19 and thrown the key into the same grave as his mother and his brother. And here is the part that I did not fully see until much later. When Lucian came down that morning, the roof was already being mended, and no one told him. He never knew there had been a gale at the Barlow farm at all. That was her genius, and it was also her tragedy. She kept the trouble from him because troubling him was, in her book, a failure of her office. And so, the master of Marchmont walked through a house in which crises were forever being met and mastered a floor beneath his notice, and mistook the deep peace of it for the natural order of the world. He thought his house was quiet because houses were quiet. He did not know it was quiet the way a lake is quiet when a strong swimmer is holding a drowning man up just under the surface, where no one can see the effort. She saw to him is the deepest truth of it. She learned his silences the way a physician learns a pulse. I will give you one instance, and it is the one that has stayed with me most, because it was the first time I understood that she knew him better than I did, and I had known him 30 years. There is a day in February, I will not give you the date, out of an old habit of protecting him, that is the anniversary of the fever, the day his brother died. His mother had gone 11 days before. Lucian never spoke of it. He never marked it. To all appearance he passed it exactly as he passed any February day. But I had noticed over the years that on that one day he did not eat, could not, I think, and that he was, if it were possible, quieter than his quiet, a stillness with something terrible held down under it, and that he took himself off alone to the long gallery where the family portraits hung and stood a long while, and no one, by an unspoken law, disturbed him there. The first February that Clara was in the house, I watched her learn it. She was new. She did not yet know the day, but she was Clara, and she felt the change in the master the way you feel the pressure drop before a storm, and I saw her watching him at breakfast, the untouched plate, the held-down stillness, with her clever eyes, working it out. By the 2nd February she knew. And on that second anniversary, when Lucian came in gray and starved-looking from the cold gallery in the late afternoon, there was set out for him, in the small warm library, alone, a particular pot of tea, a smoky, particular blend that I later learned had been his mother's, that Clara had gone to some trouble to find out from the oldest of the maids and to procure, and beside it nothing else. No word, no fuss, no sympathetic look that would have been unbearable to him. Only the tea his dead mother had liked, appearing as if of itself, at the 1 hour of the one day in the year he most needed some small warm thing and could least have asked for it. He drank it. I saw him. He stood over that pot for a long moment with his back to the room and his hand flat on the table, and then he sat and drank it, slowly, alone, and something in the terrible held-down stillness of him eased by a fraction, enough to get him through to the evening. And he never said a word to her about it, and she never said a word to him, and the next February it was there again, and the next, for 9 years, the one warm thing in the coldest day of his year, given by the one person who had troubled to learn where his wound was, and taken by a man who could not bring himself even to turn and say thank you, because to acknowledge the tea would have been to acknowledge the grief. And to acknowledge the grief he would have had to feel it in front of another living soul, and that he could not do. She knew that too, you see. She knew that the kindest thing she could do was to make the kindness invisible, so that he could receive it without the terror of being seen to need it. And so she loved him in a language deliberately pitched below his hearing, and he lived 9 years bathed in that love and called it the weather. The black moods came in November, as they always come to men who have buried people in winter, and she learned those too, and she managed them as a good nurse manages a fever she cannot cure, not by talking of it, which he would have hated, but by quietly warming the whole world around him until the worst of the cold could not reach through. In November the good beeswax candles came out early, though it was an extravagance, so that the dark evenings were golden and not gray. In November the library was kept exactly as he liked it, the fire high, his chair angled just so to the window, the books he was reading left precisely where his hand would fall on them. In November, and I loved her for this most of all, she broke her own rules and let the two great old hounds up onto the library hearth, which was strictly forbidden the rest of the year, because she had noticed that when the black weeks came on him, Lucian would put his hand down, without seeming to know he did it, and hold the loose, warm skin at a dog's neck, and be, for a moment, a little less alone. So through every November there were dogs on the hearth, and no one ever explained to the master why the rule lapsed each autumn and returned each spring, because the master must not be troubled, because Miss Hartwell had seen to it. And in 9 years he never thanked her, not once. I want to be fair to him because I loved him and because the thing is easy to tell wrongly. It was not that he despised her. It was very nearly the opposite, and that was the whole trouble. He relied upon her so completely, so absolutely, that he had ceased to see her at all, the way you do not see the floor you stand on, the air you breathe. She had become to Lucian not a person to be thanked but a condition of the world, a law of nature, as reliable and as unremarked as gravity. He no more thought to thank Miss Hartwell for keeping his house than he thought to thank the ground for holding him up. And a man does not court gravity. A man does not lie awake wondering whether the ground loves him back. I saw what he did not. I saw over those years that Clara Hartwell had come, slowly and against every scrap of her good sense, to love him. Not the Duke, the man under the marble, the boy I half remembered, whom she had somehow found without ever being told he was there. I saw it in 100 small unpaid attentions that no housekeeper's duty required. But I saw it plainest one summer evening in the 6th year, and I have never forgotten it, and it is why I did, in the end, what I did. It had been a hard day. A tenant Lucian had known from boyhood, an old shepherd named Call who had taught him to whistle a dog when he was a small boy trailing the fells, had died, and Lucian had ridden out to the funeral and stood at the back of the little church very straight and said nothing to anyone and ridden home again. And I knew, because I knew him, that it had opened the old grief a crack, the way one death always opens the door onto all the others. He came in and would not eat and went out onto the terrace alone in the long gold evening, and stood at the far balustrade with his back to the house, looking out over the park at nothing, locked in the deepest of his silences. And I, coming to the drawing-room window with some idle purpose, saw Clara in the shadow of the terrace door, a light shawl over her arm, for the evening was turning cool and she had thought, of course she had thought, that he would take a chill standing out bareheaded in his grief. And she did not go to him. She stood in the doorway with the shawl in her 2 hands and she looked at him, just looked, across the whole length of that terrace, with her whole true face open in a way I had never seen it, all the guard gone, and there was on it such tenderness and such longing and such hopeless, clear-eyed love that I had to look away, because it was not a thing a stranger had any right to see. She looked at him the way you look at something you have long since given up all hope of holding and cannot, all the same, stop wanting. And then this is the part: she did not go to him. She could have. It would have been the most natural thing, the shawl, the small kindness, a housekeeper's care. But she knew, better than I did, that in the black grip of that grief he would not have borne to be seen, not even by her, not even for a kindness, that to cross that terrace would have been to make him feel watched at the one moment he needed most to feel alone. And so she gave up her own aching wish to go to him for his sake, and she stepped back into the shadow, and she took the shawl away unused, and she sent a footman out a quarter-hour later, when the light was gone and the worst was past, with the shawl from Mrs. Fenwick's stores, your grace, against the chill. A lie, a small perfect lie, so that he might be warmed without being seen to be cared for. That was how she loved him. She loved him so well and so wisely that he never once felt the weight of it, and so he never knew it was there, and so he could go on believing, right up to the day it ended, that he was a man who neither gave nor received. She was too clear-eyed to hope. She knew exactly what she was and what he was and what the world was, and she asked for nothing and expected nothing and stayed because near him, unthanked, was better to her than away from him, thanked, anywhere else on earth. That was her folly and her greatness. She built her whole quiet contentment on the crumbs of a man's unnoticing, and she was, in her way, at peace with it. Until the season we were 39, and Lucian decided, in his correct and reasonable way, to marry. There was no romance in it, and no cruelty either, which is why I could never hate the girl. A duke owes an heir. A great name owes its continuance. Lucian had reached the age when the estate began to whisper of the future, and the lawyers to leave certain documents pointedly at the top of the pile. So he did the sensible thing. He went up to London for the season, looked over the field with the cool eye of a man buying a horse he does not intend to ride for pleasure, and settled upon Lady Sabine Caro, the Marquis of Endell's second daughter, 23, handsome and well-bred, and blessed with exactly the manners a duchess requires. She was not a cruel girl. She was not a stupid one either, as you shall see. She simply wanted what the world had raised her to want, and Lucian was the finest example of it going, and the arrangement was made between the two houses in the space of a single quiet dinner, with no more heat on either side than a treaty. He came back to Marchmont in June to set things in order, and he told Miss Hartwell, because Miss Hartwell had to be told, the house must be readied for a new mistress. I was there for that too. I have wished since that I had not been. It was in the estate-room of a morning, the ledgers open between them as always, and he said it in the middle of the ordinary business, in the same voice he used for the drains and the tithes, that he was to be married in the autumn to Lady Sabine Caro, and that the household would want reorganizing against her coming, and that he trusted Miss Hartwell would see to it as she saw to everything. I watched her take it. It was a very quiet thing to watch. She did not go white or sway or press a hand to anything. She was too well made for that. She only grew, for one instant, perfectly still, stiller than I have ever seen a living person, as still as he went, as though for one breath she had learned his own terrible trick, and then she inclined her head and said, in a voice with not a crack in it, "Of course, your grace. I shall have everything in readiness. May I offer you my sincere congratulations?" And he said, "Thank you." And there it is, do you see, the single time in 9 years he thanked her, and it was for the wrong thing entirely. He thanked her for congratulating him on the marriage that would end her, and he turned back to the ledger, and the moment was over, and he did not look at her again. But I looked at her, and I saw what he did not choose to see. I saw that Clara Hartwell had, in that one still breath, understood the whole of her situation to the bottom. She had told herself all those years that she asked for nothing. But there is a difference between asking for nothing and receiving nothing, and a person can live a long while on the first if there is, somewhere far off, the faintest ungrasped hope of the second. As long as Lucian was unmarried, as long as she was the woman at his elbow who knew his silences, there had been not hope. She was too honest for hope, but a kind of shelter, an arrangement of things in which she had her place beside him, however unnamed. A wife ended that. A wife would come and quite rightly expect the running of her own house, and Clara Hartwell would become either a servant to be commanded by a girl half her worth, or an awkwardness to be pensioned quietly off. And either way, the one truth she had lived on, that she was the one who kept him, would be taken from her and given to a stranger with a title. There was no cruelty in it. It was only the world, but it left her nothing. And worse, I am certain of this though she never said a word of it, she could not stay and watch him be, to another woman, in daylight and before God, warmer than he had ever been to her. She could bear the crumbs. She could not bear to watch the loaf given away in front of her. She would have to stand at the wedding in the corner in her gray dress and see the ring slid onto another woman's finger, and go on afterward mending that woman's household and warming that woman's November, and making that woman's tea appear at the anniversary of a grief that only she, Clara, had ever troubled to learn the shape of. There is a limit to what even a strong soul will do to itself, and she had, that morning, found hers. So she did the one thing that in 9 years no one had ever known Clara Hartwell to do. She began, quietly, to leave. She did it beautifully. Of course she did. She did everything beautifully. There was no scene, no reproach, no swoon, no letter left dramatically upon a mantle. She simply engaged a most excellent successor, a sensible, kindly widow of 50 named Mrs. Fenwick, from a neighboring county, and trained her for 6 weeks with the thoroughness she brought to all things, so that the great machine of Marchmont should not so much as stutter when its keeper stepped away from the wheel. I watched those 6 weeks without understanding them. I thought she was only being conscientious about the reorganizing for the new mistress. I did not see that she was teaching another woman, patiently, item by item, how to keep a man alive who did not know he was being kept, and that there were some things she could not teach, because they could not be written in any book of household management. She could show Mrs. Fenwick the linen and the cellars and the accounts. She could not show her the tea and the anniversary and the dogs on the November hearth. Those she wrote down anyway, I found later on a separate half-sheet in her small clear hand. In November, the beeswax candles early, the library so. The old hounds allowed the library hearth. The master is easier for it, do not ask him why. In February, on the day you will come to know, the smoky tea alone in the small library at 4 o'clock, and say nothing. A private catechism of one man's hidden wounds, left for a stranger, so that the love might go on being given after the lover was gone. I have that half-sheet still. I cannot read it without stopping. She wrote to a distant cousin in the north, a clergyman's family near the town of Aldermore, who had long offered her a home and a small place teaching in their parish school, her brother being by then grown and gone for the army and no longer needing her wages. She settled her accounts to the farthing. She said her private farewells to the servants, who wept, every one of them from the head groom to the smallest scullery maid, because they had all of them been mothered by her at one time or another and knew, if the master did not, what was walking out of the house. And through all of it Lucian noticed nothing. He was in London half the time, at the lawyers and the tailors and the Endells, and when he was at Marchmont the machine ran on as it always had, the fire lit, the letter at hand, the tea poured, so how should he see that the hand pouring it was, quietly, saying goodbye? A man does not notice gravity beginning to fail. He notices only at the very end that he is falling. She came to me once before she went. I have thought a great deal about why. I think it was because I was the only one who had ever let her know, without a word, that I saw her, that I knew what she was to that house and to that man. She found me alone in the yellow drawing-room where I was waiting on Lucian, and she did not sit, and she was very composed, and she said she had come to thank me for 9 years of kindness and to ask a favor. I said she need only name it. When I am gone, she said, he will manage, You are not to let him think otherwise, or he will feel obliged, and he does not do well with obligation. A ghost of a smile. Mrs. Fenwick is a treasure. The house will not feel it. The house, I said, and its master. For a moment I thought she would keep up the pretense. Then she looked at me with those gray eyes, straight, the way she looked at everything, and she said, very low, "You have known him longer than I. You know he does not feel things where a person can see them. I have made my peace with that. I made it years ago, but I could not make my peace with standing in the corner of the church." She stopped. She mastered it. "That is the favor, Mr. Sefton. When he marries, be kind to him. He will be quite alone, and he will not know it, which is the worst way of all, to be alone. Watch him in November." And here her voice did, for the first and only time, come very near to breaking. "If ever he should be ill in February, see that someone brings him the smoky tea. Mrs. Fenwick knows, but see to it. He will not ask. He never asks." And she pressed my hand and thanked me again and went out. And I stood in that yellow room and could not speak, because I understood, all at once and too late to be of any use, that the strongest and best heart in that entire vast house was leaving it, and that the master of it did not so much as know her Christian name was Clara. She left on a gray morning at the end of August. She took a hired gig to the village and the mail from there. She wore her gray traveling dress, and she carried one small trunk, 9 years of a life fitting into one small trunk, and she did not look back at the house, and there was no one at the door but me, for Lucian was in London and did not know the date and had not thought to ask it. I watched the gig out of sight down the long avenue under the limes, and then I went back into Marchmont Hall, and I want to tell you that though nothing in it had yet changed, the same clocks ticking, the same fires lit, Mrs. Fenwick already competent at her post, the house was, from that hour, a different house. It had lost its heart and did not yet know. It was a body that would go on breathing for a little while out of habit before it understood that it had died. Lucian came down from town 3 days later. I was staying at Marchmont that autumn. I had a bad leg and a worse cottage, and he had, in his silent way, simply installed me in the blue room years before and never mentioned it, which was as near to affection as he came, so I was there for all of it from the very first hour. I saw him arrive, hand his hat to the footman, walk into his own hall and stop. He could not have told you why, but I saw him stop. He stood in the middle of the great cold hall and he listened, the way an animal listens, and something in him had gone wrong and he did not know what. Mrs. Fenwick came forward and curtsied, and said all was in order, your grace, and it was, and he said something correct, and he went into the library where the fire was lit and the decanter set out, and everything was exactly as it should be. And that, I think, was the first small dreadful crack, because it was too exact. It was the house done by the book, done perfectly and coldly, and Lucian had lived 9 years inside a house done by the heart without ever once noticing the difference, until the difference walked in the door. "Where is Miss Hartwell?" he asked me that first evening, only that, 2 days he had been home before he asked. "Gone, Lucian," I said. "She left her place a fortnight since. She has gone to relations in the north." He was pouring wine. He did not spill it. He was too well made like her. They were more alike than either would ever know. He set the decanter down and he said, "Left her place," as though the words did not go together. "She said nothing to me of leaving." "She gave the proper notice," I said. "She trained her successor most thoroughly. You were in London. I imagine she thought it was managed." "Managed," he repeated, and then after a silence, in a voice I did not much like, "Where in the north?" "I don't know that she said," I lied. God forgive me, because I did not, that night, think he had any right to it. He said nothing more. He drank his wine and read his letters and went up at his usual hour, and a stranger would have seen a duke perfectly at his ease in his own library. But I had known him 31 years, and I saw that under the marble something had begun, very slowly, to move, a great slow settling, like the first inch of a wall that has been undermined, and does not yet know it must fall. It came down over the autumn, stone by stone, and it was terrible to watch, And the worst of it was that I do not think he ever, for a long time, understood what was happening to him. He had never learned the names of his own feelings. He had spent 20 years making very sure he would never need them. And so when the grief came for Clara Hartwell, it came without a name, and he could not treat it, because he could not say what it was. At first it wore the mask of small vexations. The house, run competently now instead of lovingly, began to fail him in 1,000 tiny ways he had never in his life had to notice, because they had never once happened. I will give you the smallest of them, because it was the one that first told me how deep the thing went. One September evening he rang and asked Mrs. Fenwick, quite mildly. He was never harsh with servants, for a book, a particular volume of an old campaign history he had been reading, and Mrs. Fenwick, willing and flustered, could not find it, because it was not on the table by his chair where it had always been. And I saw Lucian's face as he watched her search, and it was not annoyance, it was something closer to fear. A man who has reached out in the dark for a wall he has leaned on all his life and found only air. He said, "It does not matter," and it plainly mattered. And he sat that evening with no book at all, staring at the fire, and I understood that the loss was not the book. The book had always been there because Clara had marked where he stopped reading and left it open at his hand. It was never the book. It was that someone had known where he was in it, and no one knew now where he was in anything. His coffee was good, and it was not the particular blend, brought without asking, and he drank it and said nothing, and I saw him not say something a dozen times a day that autumn, reach for a comfort that was no longer there and close his hand on nothing and go on. The fires were lit, but 10 minutes after he felt the cold, not before it, and a man who has been warm all his life before he knew he was cold does not know how to say I am cold now, and I was not, when she was here. He grew short with the servants, which he had never been, finding fault coldly and not knowing with what. And the servants, who had all loved Clara, bore it and grieved and did not understand either. And the whole great house went about under a pall it could not name, mourning a housekeeper as though she had died, while its master walked through the middle of the morning and thought the grayness was in the weather. And then came November. I had dreaded it. I remembered Clara's voice, "Watch him in November," and I watched, and there was nothing I could do, because the things that had held him through November for 9 years were things I did not know how to do, and Mrs. Fenwick, for all her worth, did only imperfectly, following a half-sheet of paper without the love that had written it. The beeswax candles came out, she had left the instruction, but they were lit a week late and blown out early to save them, and the evenings were gray. The library was kept nearly right and not quite, the chair an inch wrong, the fire a little low. And the dogs were not let up onto the hearth, because Mrs. Fenwick, reading the strange instruction, had been too much in awe of the master to break so plain a rule on her own authority, and had meant to ask him and never dared. And so the old hounds lay by the door as the rule required, and Lucian sat through the black November evenings with his hand hanging empty at the side of his chair, reaching down now, and then in the old unthinking way for warm, loose skin that was not there, and finding the cold floor and drawing his hand back, and not knowing, why the dark was so much darker this year than it had ever been. I could not bear it. One evening near the middle of the month I got up and opened the library door and whistled the old hounds up onto the hearth myself, breaking the rule, and Lucian looked at me, and looked at the dogs settling with great groans against the fire, and something moved in his face that was very near to pain, and he said low, "She used to do that. In November." I never, and he stopped, and put his hand down into the warm fur, and did not finish, and we sat a long time in silence with the dogs between us, and I think it was the first moment he came near to knowing what had left him, though he still had no word for it, and would not have one for a long time yet. The betrothal ground on through all of this. Lady Sabine came down with her mother to view her future kingdom, and I will give the girl this, she was quicker than he was. She spent 3 days at Marchmont, and she was gracious and handsome and correct, and on the 3rd evening she asked me to walk with her in the long gallery, and she said, without any drama at all, "Mr. Sefton." Who was the housekeeper who left? I said carefully that Miss Hartwell had kept the house many years and lately gone to relations. Lady Sabine looked at the rain on the tall windows. He speaks of her, she said. Not to me. He does not know he does it, he says, Miss Hartwell always, and then he stops. I have heard him do it 4 times in 3 days. Once he said, in November she used to and could not go on, and looked as though I had struck him and I had said nothing at all. She turned and looked at me, and she was not angry. She was, if anything, a little sad and older than her years. I am to marry a man who is haunted by his housekeeper and does not know it. I have watched him this week, Mr. Sefton, and he is the loneliest creature I have ever seen. And the strange thing is that the loneliness has a shape, and the shape is a woman, and it is not me, and it never will be. I have no wish to spend my life in a cold house being compared, in a silence I am not even permitted to hear, to a ghost he will not admit he is grieving. She smiled faintly. I am handsome and I am well dowered, Mr. Sefton. I shall do very well elsewhere. I do not think I shall do it all here. And I do not think, if you will forgive me, that I should be doing him any kindness by trying. She released him within the week. She did it kindly and cleverly, letting it be understood between the houses that the young lady's affections were, on reflection, otherwise engaged, a fiction the Endells were glad to accept, since no one likes a jilting. No blame fell on Lucian. He was left in the space of a fortnight, unbetrothed, unhousekept, and though he still had not the word for it, bereft. And here is the strangest part of the whole strange business, the part I did not understand until much later. When the engagement ended, Lucian felt relief. He felt it the way a man feels the loosening of a bond he had not known was cutting him, and he did not examine it, because to examine it would have been to ask why the ending of a marriage he had chosen should feel like a reprieve. And the answer to that question lay in the north, teaching sums, and he was not yet ready to go looking for it. But grief that has no name does not go away for being ignored. It goes down. It goes into the body. By December Lucian was not sleeping. He would not eat but at my urging. He, who had ridden the estate in all weathers for 20 years, now sat by the library fire for whole days, a book open and unread on his knee, staring into the flames with a stillness that was no longer his old marble control but something worse, an absence, as though the man had gone somewhere and left the shape of himself behind. The black November mood that Clara had always, quietly, held him through had come in November and never left. It had settled over him like a fog off the sea and thickened as the year died, and there was no one now who knew how to lift it, because the only one who had ever known was gone. I grew frightened for him. I had seen him grieve once before, at 19, and turn to marble to survive it. I began to be afraid that this second grief, coming to a man who had used up all his marble 20 years before, might not be survived at all. He caught a chill riding out bareheaded in sleet. He had taken to riding out for hours in the worst of the weather, which frightened me more than anything, for it was not the act of a man who cared much whether he came back, and the chill went to his chest, and by the middle of December he was truly ill, feverish and gray, and sunk in his great bed with the physician shaking his head in the passage over a man who, he said plainly, seemed to have no wish to mend. It was on the worst night of that fever that Lucian Marchmont, at last, said something true. I was sitting up with him. The physician had gone to snatch an hour's sleep. The nurse was dozing in the next room. The house was dark and the wind was in the chimneys, and Lucian lay burning and half out of his senses, and I held his hand, which I had not done since we were boys, and I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life. And in the depth of the night he began to speak low and broken, and not to me, to her. "Clara," he said, and I sat up as though I had been struck, because in 9 years I had never once heard him call her anything but Miss Hartwell, and I had genuinely wondered whether he knew her name at all. "Clara," he said again, "the fire's gone out." And then worse, you always came before it went out. Where?" And a long silence, and then, so quietly I have never told another living soul until this telling, "I never told you. I never once, I let you go, and I never told you a single. Why did you not make me say it? Why did you not? And he wept, my Lucian, the man of marble, wept in the dark like the boy I had lost 20 years before, and he said her name over and over, Clara, Clara, and once, terribly, the T. It is February. Where is the she always? Though it was December, his fever had lost the months, and he was reaching, burning, for the one small warm thing that had held him through his worst days for 9 years, and it was 300 miles away. And I sat and held his hand and wept myself, and I understood at last, wholly and too late, the size of what had walked out of that house in a hired gig in August. He did not die. He was too strong for that, or perhaps grief is not, in the end, a thing men die of, whatever the poets say. The fever broke near dawn, and he lay for 2 days as weak and quiet as a child, and on the third day he was well enough to be propped against his pillows and take a little broth, and on that third day he looked at me clearly for the first time and said, in his own voice, quite steady, "Julian." I said things, I think, in the fever. "You did," I said. He looked at his hands on the coverlet. This great, proud, self-possessed man who had ruled a county without ever raising his voice could not for a long moment meet my eye. "How much," he said, "do you know?" "All of it, Lucian," I said gently. "I think I have known it longer than you have." And then he did the bravest thing I ever saw him do, braver than anything he did after, though there was much to come. He looked up at me and he let his face be seen, the whole ruined truth of it, the fear and the shame and the loss, all the feeling he had spent 20 years making certain no one would ever witness, and he said, "I love her. I have loved her for years. I did not know it. I did not let myself know it because," his jaw worked, "because I have buried everyone I ever loved, and I could not, I would not, and so I told myself she was only the housekeeper, and I let her keep my whole life together with her 2 hands, and I never gave her one word, not one. And she loved me, Julian. I know now that she loved me. I saw it 100 times and I would not look, and I let her walk out of this house alone, and I did not even know the day." His voice broke clean across. "Do you know what I remembered in the fever? The tea. In February. 9 years she put it at my hand on the worst day of my life, and I never once turned around and thanked her, because to thank her I should have had to say aloud that I was grieving, and I would not. And so I took her kindness with my back turned every year for 9 years. That is the kind of man I have been. I am 39 years old, and the best thing that ever came into my life served me for 9 years, and I never learned to say her name. What sort of man?" "The sort," I said, "who was hurt very badly, very young, and did the only thing he knew to keep from being hurt again. But you are not that boy any longer, Lucian, and she is not dead. She is in Aldermore, and you are wasting daylight." He stared at me. "You said you did not know where she was." "I lied," I said. "I did not 3 months ago think you deserved to know. I have changed my mind. Get well and go and find her, and do the one thing you have never in your life done. Tell her the truth to her face and let her decide." He got well with a speed that alarmed the physician and gratified me. Within the fortnight, it was hard on Christmas by then, and the roads were foul with snow. He was on his feet and thin and pale and utterly transformed in the one way that mattered. He had stopped, for the first time since he was 19, defending himself against his own heart. He was frightened still. I could see it. But it was the clean, forward-facing fright of a man about to do a hard, true thing, not the old locked dread of a man defending himself against everything. He would not wait for the roads to clear. I argued. He did not hear me. He ordered the traveling carriage and the 4 best horses and a change waiting at every stage, and on the day before Christmas Eve, in weather that no sane man travels in, the Duke of Marchmont set out north to find his housekeeper. He asked me to come. I would not have missed it for the crown of England. The journey was 3 cold, hard days of it, the snow driving and the roads half lost, and I shall tell you a little of it, because it was on that road that the last of the marble came off him, mile by frozen mile. The first day he was all resolve, sitting forward, willing the horses north. But resolve is a thing of the daylight, and it was in the nights that the truth of what he was doing came up in him. At the first inn, a decent enough place on the Great North Road, he did not sleep. I heard him through the wall up and packing, and when I looked in on him near 2 in the morning, he was standing at the black window with his hand flat on the cold glass, and he said, without turning, "I have been sitting here trying to think what I shall say to her, Julian, and I find I do not know how. I have never in my life said a thing of this kind to a living soul. I do not have the words. I have spent 20 years making certain I should never need them, and now I need them more than I have ever needed anything, and I do not have them." And I said the words would come, and he said, "And if they do not? If I stand before her and the old silence takes me and I cannot, I shall have come 300 miles to stand mute in front of her and prove, one last time, exactly the thing I am." I told him that if the words would not come, he had only to stand there and let her see his face, for the truth was written all over it now for any fool to read, and that Clara had been reading his face for 9 years and would read it still. He was quiet a while, and then he said, "She read it, all those years. She read it and answered it, and I gave her nothing back. And there was no self-pity in it, only a plain, terrible reckoning, and I left him at the window with it, for there are griefs a man must sit up with alone. The second night was worse and better both. We were far north by then, the country gone bare and white and grand, and he had had a whole day of the empty snow to think in, and when we stopped at a rough small inn under a fell, he did not pace. He sat by the fire with a glass he did not drink, and he talked, more than I had heard him talk in 20 years, all of it circling the one fear. There was a curate, he said low, in her cousin's parish. I gathered it from something Mrs. Fenwick let fall, a good young man, near her own age, unmarried. What if she has done the sensible thing, Julian? The thing I never once let her do at Marchmont, married a man who could say it, who could give her in a single ordinary week more than I gave her in 9 years. What if I come and she is happy, truly happy, settled and warm and done with cold, silent men? What right have I to walk into that and unbuild it for my own hunger? I have taken enough from her. I took 9 years and gave nothing. Am I now to take her peace as well? And I said the thing I most believed, which was that he did not know, that he could not know, that all his life he had settled these questions alone in the dark and settled them wrongly, deciding for other people what they felt and never once asking, and that the whole of his errand, the entire point of these 300 frozen miles, was to stop doing that, to lay the truth before her plainly, and for the first time in his life let another soul decide, instead of deciding for her in silence and calling it consideration. He looked at me a long moment across the firelight, and then he said very simply, "Yes, that is right. That is exactly the thing I have never done." And he slept that night a little. We came into Aldermore on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, under a low gray sky and a thin hard snow. The little gray town huddled under a fell with the smoke standing straight up from its chimneys in the still cold. We found the cousin's house, a modest square parsonage by the church, and Lucian, who had faced the House of Lords and the deaths of everyone he loved without a tremor, sat in the carriage before that plain door with his gloved hands shaking, and could not, for a full minute, make himself get down. "She is teaching," said the cousin's wife, a kind, bewildered woman who did not in the least know what to make of a duke on her step. "In the schoolroom at the back. It is the Christmas practice, the little ones, they are to sing tomorrow, and she would have let us round, but Lucian said, 'Lo, please, let me go alone.' I stayed. He went round the side of the house through the ankle-deep snow, and I am not proud of it, but I have never once regretted it, followed at a distance and stood at the corner where I could see, because I had earned, I thought, the right to see the end of the thing I had watched from the beginning. The schoolroom was a low stone building with tall windows, warm-lit against the gray afternoon, and through the glass I could see a dozen small children in rows, and Clara Hartwell before them in her gray dress, leading them through a carol with her hands, her face turned from us, that true, warm, unguarded face, warm now with the pleasure of the children and the song, more alive than I had ever seen it inside the cold splendor of Marchmont. She looked well. She looked, God help him, happy, in the small plain way that is the only kind that lasts. And Lucian stood in the snow outside the window and looked at the life she had made without him, at the proof that she had not needed him to be whole. And I saw him understand fully that he had truly no claim, that he had come 300 miles to lay his heart at the feet of a woman who had every right in the world to hand it back. And I saw him, being for the first time in his life the man Clara had somehow always known was in there, decide to do it anyway. He knocked at the schoolroom door. She opened it herself, still half turned to the children, saying something over her shoulder. And then she saw who stood on the step, snow on his dark shoulders, hat in his shaking hands, and every scrap of color went out of her face, and then came flooding back. And the carol behind her faltered and stopped, and the two of them stood in that open doorway with the warm room behind her and the cold white world behind him, and for a long moment neither could speak at all. I was too far to hear the beginning of it. I saw her say his name, Your Grace. I saw the shape of it on her lips, the old guard coming up, the retreat into the only safe word. And I saw him do the thing I had come 300 miles to see him do. He shook his head. And though I could not hear it, I have made him tell me since more than once exactly what he said, and I can give it to you true. He said, No, not that. I have not come as the Duke of Marchmont. I have left him at the door. I find I do not want him any more. He cost me the only thing I ever, and he stopped, and he made himself go on, this man who had never in 20 years finished a sentence about his own heart. Miss Hartwell, Clara. I have come 300 miles in the snow to say to your face a thing I should have said 9 years ago, and I am going to say it very badly, because I have never learned how, because I would not let myself learn, and that is the whole of what is wrong with me and the whole of what I did to you. You kept my house for 9 years. You kept me. You knew every silence in me, and you filled every dark day, and you never once asked for anything, and I took all of it, every day of it. And I never gave you one word, not one, because I was a coward, because I have buried everyone I ever loved and I was too afraid to love again. And so I told myself you were furniture. You were the floor. You were the air, you, Clara, the best and truest soul I have ever known. And I let you walk out of my life alone, and I did not even trouble to learn the day you went. She had one hand pressed to her mouth. The children behind her had gone silent and round-eyed. The snow came down. He went on. I remembered the tea, he said, and his voice was not steady now at all. In the fever I remembered the tea. 9 years, Clara, every February. On the worst day of my whole life you put my mother's tea at my hand and asked nothing, and I never once turned around, because to turn around would have been to let you see me grieve, and I could not. And so I let you love me with my back turned for 9 years, and I called it the ordinary weather of my life. And then you were gone, and it was February in my heart every day, and there was no tea, and no one on this earth who knew there ought to be, and I understood at last what I had thrown away. It was never the house you were holding up. It was me. I did not know a man could be so entirely held up by one person until I had to try to stand without you, and found that I could not stand at all. I am not going to pretend I have any right to be here, he said. You have made a life. You look, his voice cracked and held, you look happy, and God knows I have no claim on it. And if there is a good man here who can say to you every day the plain, warm things I could not say in 9 years, then he deserves you a great deal better than I do, and you have only to tell me so, and I shall go, and I shall not trouble you again as long as I live. But I could not let another day pass with it unsaid. I love you. I have loved you for years and been too great a fool and too great a coward to know it, and I only learned it when you were gone and my whole life fell down. I am not asking you to come back and keep my house. I would not so insult you. I am asking, and here the Duke of Marchmont, before a dozen farm children and the falling snow and his oldest friend spying shamelessly round a corner, went down in his fine ruined traveling clothes onto one knee in the snow of a Cumberland doorstep. I am asking you to marry me. Not the Duke, me, Lucian, the fool who never said your name. I know I do not deserve a yes. I have come all this way to give you, at last, the chance to say no to my face, which is more than I ever gave you the courtesy of before. And Clara Hartwell stood in the doorway of that little school with her hand at her mouth and the tears running down her true face, and she looked at him kneeling in the snow, and I saw her whole heart at war in her, the 9 years of unhoped hope and the pride and the fear of being made a fool of and the terrible aching wanting she had spent so long teaching herself to bury. And she said, in a voice that shook and did not break, "You are kneeling in the snow, Your Grace. You will take a chill. You have only just been ill." "How do you know I have been ill?" he said. "Because Mr. Sefton wrote to me," she said, and I confess I felt myself go warm about the ears, though he had the grace not to tell me why, and I have done nothing but worry these 3 weeks, which is a great foolishness in a woman who was very firmly resolved to have made her peace. And then the thing that had been fighting in her face gave way all at once, the way a frozen river gives way, and she went down into the snow herself, right down on her knees in the doorway before them also that they were kneeling face to face in the cold with the warm room at her back, and she took his cold, shaking hands in her 2 hands, the 2 hands that had held his whole life together for 9 unthanked years, and she said, "You great, silent, impossible man. 9 years I loved you and you never, and there was no curate, whatever you fancied, there was never anyone, there could never have been anyone, don't you know that even now, and now you come 300 miles in December and kneel in the snow like something out of a book." And she was laughing and weeping both at once. "Yes, yes, not the Duke. You, God help me, always you. It was only ever you. It was you on the terrace with the shawl, and you at the fire with the dogs, and you every February with the tea, and every single time I thought, he will never see me, and I loved you anyway, and I would have gone to my grave loving you and never told you. And you have spared me that at least, you impossible man. You have come and spared me that." And he made a sound I had never heard him make, half a laugh and half a sob, and he gathered her up out of the snow and against him, and held her the way a drowning man holds the thing that saves him, and over her shoulder, kneeling there in the white doorway, Lucian Marchmont met my eye where I stood shamelessly at the corner, and he did not look proud, or silent, or like marble at all. He looked like a boy of 19 who had gone into a sick room 20 years before, and at long last come out again. And he smiled at me, the old warm, quick smile I had thought lost forever, and I turned away and let them be, and stood in the snow of that little northern town and thanked God, plainly and aloud, for a Christmas Eve I had never thought to see. They were married in Aldermore in her cousin's parish in the 2nd week of January. She would not be married from Marchmont, and I understood her, and so did he. It was a small wedding, and a plain one, the little school children lining the frozen path with sprigs of holly, and there was more warmth in that little gray church than in all the marble staterooms of Marchmont Hall put together. She wore gray, of course. She would always wear gray. It was hers, and he loved it, and it became the Duchess of Marchmont far better than diamonds would have. And when they came home at last to Marchmont, the great cold house that had lost its heart in a hired gig and now got it back in a traveling carriage, the whole household turned out into the snowy court to meet them, 40 servants and more, the ones who had wept when she left, and they cheered her, every one, the head groom weeping openly and not ashamed, and the smallest scullery maid running out with a posy, and Mrs. Fenwick, who, far from being displaced, was kept on gladly, and thanked at last for her patient stewardship of a house she had been given no way to truly warm, Mrs. Fenwick standing at the door with tears on her sensible face. And Clara went down the line of them with her hands out, and her true warm face shining, and knew every name and asked after every trouble, because she had never forgotten one of them. And Lucian walked beside her through the cheering of his own people, and looked about him at the house he had thought he ruled, and understood at last that he had only ever been a guest in it, and that its true sovereign had come home. He is not a silent man now. Oh, he is quiet still. You do not undo 40 years in a season, but the silence is a different thing entirely. It is the quiet of a man at peace, not a man walled up. He says her name 100 times a day, I think for the pure pleasure of finally being able to. He thanks her for things, small things, absurd things, the fire and the tea and the morning, making up with a kind of tender desperation for 9 years of thanklessness, and she laughs at him and tells him to stop, and does not mean it. On the anniversary of the fever she brings him his mother's tea, and now he takes her hand when she sets it down, and holds it, and does not turn his back, and they sit together in the February dark that no longer frightens him because he is no longer alone in it. In November the beeswax candles are lit early, and the dogs are on the hearth by right and not by stealth, and he keeps his hand in the warm fur and his wife within reach, and gets through the black weeks like a man crossing a river with a strong arm to hold. There are children in time, a dark, still, watchful boy and a fair laughing girl who is exactly her mother. And the house that was built for a family is a family's house again at last, and there is warmth in every room of it, and no fire ever goes out before it is felt. I am an old man now, and I have told this story a good many times, and people always ask me the same thing at the end of it. How could he not have known? How could a clever, powerful, capable man live 9 years beside the love of his life and never see it? And I tell them the truth, which is this. It is the easiest thing in the world, and the most common and the most terrible. We do not see the ones who hold us up. We see the ballroom beauty and the great match and the correct arrangement, and we do not see the quiet gray figure at our elbow who has, without a word, without a thank you, without one thing given back, kept us alive. We take the floor for granted until the day it is gone and we fall. Lucian was luckier than most. He fell and there was time, and I knew where she was, and he was brave enough at the very last, when it had cost him everything, to go and kneel in the snow and say the word. Most men are not so lucky. Most men never fall in time. So if there is a gray figure at your elbow, reader, who knows your silences and fills your dark days and asks nothing back, do not be a duke about it. Do not wait for the house to fall. Learn her name and say the other word too, the one that cost my friend 9 years and a fever and 300 miles of snow to learn. Say it while she is still in the doorway. Do not let her pause there with her hand upon the frame, and choose and go. That is the whole of what I know.